starting now the fifth and the last session, which will talk about countering extremism and strengthening religious and cultural diplomacy. I have with me three speakers in this session and one woman, 3 men and 1. I have here His Excellency Maqsoud Kruse, Chairman of the National Human Hidayah Rights Institution. He was a former Executive Director of Hidayah, International Center of Excellence for Countering Violent Extremism. On my left side, Dr. August Hanning, former President of the German Federal Intelligence Service, BND, and Dr. Guido Steinberg, German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP, an old friend. Since you are 2 German and 1 Emirati, I will start this time with the Emirati. Please, Dr. Maqsoud.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies. Basically, when you look at my name, you have the first name being Emirati, Maqsoud, and the family name is a German name, Kruse. So I'm not entirely Emirati either, so I apologize for that. The Germans are all over the place. As we speak about cultural diplomacy, religious diplomacy, as we talk about extremism, we are talking about something as simple as this. If we are moving forward with our collective thinking, our understanding and appreciation of the world that we want, then we're moving forward towards a very simple notion: the need to promote a culture of life, a culture of construction, in the face of a culture of death, a culture of destruction. The great German writer Goethe once said, "Willing is not enough, we must do. Knowing is not enough, we must apply." I spent 7 years as part of the Hidayah International Center of Excellence for countering violent extremism. And after 7 years of service and moving forward looking into issues of human rights, issues of communication, issues of culture, the question for me remains what we have done so far, how much of our collective efforts we have accomplished, and where we need to go as we move forward. With that, I would like to highlight 3 key ideas, and they're just ideas, they're not information, they're not fact, simply a roadmap maybe guiding this discussion. The first idea is this: culture is key. And if I look at my own personal story, it starts with a connection of 2 hearts, and I would argue I could be the embodiment of the UAE-Germany relations. This is how far you can go. I don't know if we want this result all the time. But humans, people, us, all of us, we are the center of the relationships. Therefore, culture is the beginning, but it's not the end. Culture is where we exchange thoughts, feelings. This is where we have arts, music. This is where we move forward in a variety of settings. I still remember my own German grandmother, where she used to play her piano, and I'm sitting next to her here in Abu Dhabi, playing Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Still rings in my head, still rings in my heart, still echoes in everywhere, and everyone recognizes this melody. It makes a difference. In the same token, as we express different aspects of the culture, what we are doing, we are bridging the human, let alone the color, let alone the religion, let alone the biases and also inherent different ideas about each other, and let's actually introduce ourselves, one another again and again. Culture is not static, it's constantly evolving, constantly moving, and therefore with that, culture can be a vehicle, can be a process, can be a journey, and there's a lot that we can exchange and a lot on commonalities. And maybe I'll conclude with the issue of language. Germans brag about how sophisticated that language is. I would argue Emiratis, Arabs in general, have the same brag about the sophistication of their language, where you have a word for everything and everything has a meaning, including the names. For example, Her Excellency, her name Ebtesam means a smile. And with that, hope and exchanges will always be there. And therefore, these exchanges and the cultures are important. The second thought that I'd like to share with you is the following. When we look into the common challenges, and we can all agree in this room, extremism, violent extremism, terrorism, whatever you want to name it, label it, describe it, is a common challenge and threat. And in my previous capacity, we had exchanges with our German counterparts, and I think that challenge is still there. The question is still there. There are those out there who don't want such meetings to take place. They don't want that the West and the East have exchanges. They don't want Europeans and non-Europeans, Arabs and non-Arabs to have this kind of dialogue, that kind of openness, that kind of frankness, being bold and brave in bridging that gap. Some, they don't want this. However, when we debate what is extremism and our different variations and definitions, here I think where we'll find that the devil is in the detail. If I talk about freedom of speech, and then I talk about incitement of hate, incitement of violence, where do we draw the line? What does it actually mean? And how far we can go? When we talk about the freedom of thinking and expression, and then destructive ideologies, certain views of the world, where you discriminate between one individual and another, and when you see yourself being superior just because you have certain worldview, that's another angle we can debate and can discuss and look into it. The challenge, the threat is the same, but the details, the variations, the evolution might not be. However, maintaining that sort of openness and understanding of what extremism is and what is not is important. Finally, we talk about religion, religious diplomacy. We talk about variations of what faith really means. And frankly, when I put my story up front to anyone who meets me for the first time, how would you describe someone like me? Am I white or black? Am I European or Arab? Am I Christian, Muslim, Chrislam? None of the above? All of the above? At the end of the day, and this is what Socrates once said, I'm not an Athenian nor a Greek, I'm a citizen of the world. What I'm trying to say is this. We can pretend that there are serious barriers between cultures, between relations, and especially between UAE and Germany. But these barriers, in my opinion, are meaningless. If I'm sitting today somewhere in Berlin, wearing my fantastic suit, showing you my fantastic hair, speaking in German, and telling you exactly the same story, only I'm a senior official in Germany, I would be a superstar. I remember when Tic Tac Toe, fantastic band from the 1990s, came, half German, and they were half white, half brown, just looking like me. They were cool, they were awesome. Again, it's the angle, it's the perception, and it's that barrier that we need all to agree. It's just that, a mental barrier. I know we had a tough session today with a lot of confrontational ideas and thoughts, but I hope with this brief statement that we can agree that at least the human element, the human component, what it means to be a person before anything else is what really matters at the end of the day. And if a young man from Berlin could come in the 1960s to Abu Dhabi to marry a beautiful woman and have 3 ugly children, I'm number 2, then it is possible to happen everywhere. And I'm not trying to be idealist, but that's reality, a true story. And the more we can tell such stories, and the more we can bridge, we'll see more in common than difference, and we can see opportunities rather than to see challenges. Thank you very much.
I think Maqsoud is a good model and product of German Emirati exchange.
Your Excellency, made in Germany, assembled in Jabal Ali, I have to say.
Okay, at least not Chinese.
No comments.
Well, I will move to Guido, please. Yeah, it's your turn. Okay, don't be charmed like Maqsoud, okay? And talk to the hard issues.
Okay, I'm just trying to find some way to come to the terrorist subject now. But anyhow, I'll just throw you into the cold water. I've been thinking a lot about how important the terrorism and extremism subject is still after the end of the war on terror in 2021. And of course, like all those who work on these niches of international relations or, let's call it, or political science, I do of course believe that it's still a relevant topic. And I think most people here in this audience will agree. If I was to define the major threats to Germany, the strategic threats in 2022, I would always, of course, or even some years ago, I would have said, well, first it's the conventional threat posed by Russia, not directly to Germany, but to the Baltic states. I have to confess, I would have expected something with some activity with regard to the Baltic states before Ukraine. I was wrong. Secondly, the proliferation of missiles and nuclear weapons in the Middle East, primarily in Iran, but also in other countries. And thirdly, the proliferation of terrorist groups, transnational, international, trying to attack us, our interests, and our allies. And I've been thinking a little bit whether this still applies, and I would say yes. Although we have, of course, an internal German debate about what the more important threat is, right-wing extremist terrorism or Islamist terrorism, but I don't think we have to discuss this problem here. It's a purely domestic thing. And now, my second point is about the nature of the threat. I will only add some points or assemble some points that I think of as important because I know that we are all running out of time. My second point is what has changed in recent years in international terrorism. I've been thinking about this for a long time as well, and I think the major tactical development is that terrorist groups have started to attack us, or have started trying to attack us by directing attacks. What does that mean? A traditional terrorist attack by a transnationalist or a transnational organization like Al-Qaeda or ISIS is organized in a certain place, be it Pakistan, Syria, or Somalia. Most of the perpetrators are sent to the country where they are supposed to perpetrate the attack, perhaps align with some locals and then perpetrate the attacks. September 11 was such an attack, planned and organized in Pakistan, partly organized in other countries, including Germany, and then perpetrated in the United States. If you had told me, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, that it would be possible to replace these tactics by a virtual direction of attacks, I would have told you that's science fiction, that's impossible. But that is exactly something that has happened in recent years. And it's one organization that stands for this modernization of international terrorism, and it's ISIS. And it's ISIS in Syria, it's ISIS in Iraq, but it's also ISIS in Afghanistan. We have had what I consider one of the most creative terrorism plots in recent years in early 2019, when a group of Tajik citizens from Tajikistan were ordered by a leading Dagestani member of ISIS based in eastern Syria, in Baghuz, to perpetrate an attack. At the same time, they were directed ideologically by a Tajik leading member of ISIS in Afghanistan, located in Kunar, and they were given lessons via their iPhones. They congregated in a little room, they posed the iPhone in the middle, and then were given religious lessons in their native tongue. And in the end, they decided, well, we perpetrate attacks. So it was an attack, or it was an attack plot, which was thwarted because the Americans gave our authorities the necessary information, but it was an attack plan that was purely virtual. Somebody as far away as Afghanistan, somebody as far away as eastern Syria, was able to kick off the planning of an attack in Germany, and quite a serious one. One of the possible targets was the NATO base in Geilenkirchen. You might not know it, but you might know the planes stationed there, the AWACS. Why is this important? Because it tells you something about the future of terrorism. We don't have to of course we have to watch our borders. That's something you have to tell our German government sometimes. But it's not about borders anymore. And I think that is something we have to keep in mind. My third point, why is the situation then better today than it was perhaps in 2017? Because in order to kick off such a virtually directed attack, you still need a big organization that is able to convince young people in Germany or in Saudi Arabia or in Nigeria or in Australia to perpetrate such an attack. So it needs to be attractive. And ISIS in 2019 still was attractive to them. ISIS Afghanistan was attractive to them, might still be attractive to many young people. But what we do see today is a fragmentation of the terrorist scene. We have all kinds of relatively weak, small terrorist groups operating in Afghanistan, in the Caucasus, in Mozambique, in Nigeria, in other places, and it's not totally clear where the next major big organization will develop. The only thing that I think history tells us is it will. The big organization will evolve, and if it finds the means to communicate with followers worldwide, I think that is one of the threats that we have to prepare for, a new kind of virtual terrorism in the future, making some of what we have been doing, closing borders and so on, virtually meaningless. That was my third point, the importance of organizations. So my fourth point now comes to what I think is important for any discussion of this topic between Emiratis and Germans. First, these will be three subsections. First about Sunni jihadists, then about Shia groups, and thirdly about extremist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. First aspect is the Sunni jihadist movement. We do have a major shift in the movement in recent years. And it's a shift from Al-Qaeda-related groups to ISIS. That's my personal interpretation. I don't believe in Al-Qaeda anymore. And the main reason is that the organization is hardly able to attract followers. Might be able to attract followers in backwaters like Yemen, to some extent, several thousand. But the big international force or transnational force of recent years has been ISIS, attracting tens of thousands of followers, many more than Al-Qaeda was ever able to attract worldwide. And part of the reason is that they are ideologically different. To make it a bit simple, correct me if I'm wrong, Al-Qaeda is an organization that at least partially was funded in Muslim Brotherhood thinking and the revolutionary thinking of Sayyid Qutb and others. And that's part of the reason why it has lost its appeal. It's pragmatic, it's power-oriented, it's policy or politics-oriented, and ISIS is not. ISIS is much more prone, or ISIS is mainly based on Wahhabi thinking, originating on the Arabian Peninsula, and it is mainly interested in implementing Sharia now. And that is one of the reasons that many young Muslims, many young Islamists worldwide have been attracted by this organization. But it tells us also something about where we have to go if we want to fight the phenomenon. We don't have to go to the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood is not the catalyst of Sunni Islamist terrorism in recent years anymore. It was in the past when Al-Qaeda was a force to be reckoned with. I don't think it is anymore. And the ideological roots of the movement, they do have an address, and the address is in the Arabian Peninsula. And if you want to take a look at where these people take their thoughts from, take a look at the libraries that they publish. It's all Wahhabi literature. Sayyid Qutb is not a part of it anymore. And that is something I think we have to discuss. That's my first point. The second point is something that I learned in the UAE. I remember I had a discussion with Sulaiman Al-Hatlan, a Saudi journalist. I think he's still based here, Sky News Arabia at that time. We had a long discussion about jihadism in Europe. It was the time when ISIS perpetrated all these horrific attacks in Germany, France, Belgium, and other countries. Talked for about an hour. After this hour, he asked me, well, why don't you Europeans take Shia terrorists seriously? Iran-related terrorists seriously? And of course I had an answer publicly, but I started thinking about it. And this is something we will have to talk about in the next years, and I think Sulaiman was absolutely right, and I think many Emiratis are right when they confront us with a certain complacence of Europeans with regard to terrorist groups, which might be potentially even more powerful than ISIS and Al-Qaeda, like Lebanese Hezbollah, like Kataib Hezbollah, Asaib al-Haq, the Houthis, you name them. And I think the most important aspect that we have to discuss for the time being is the Houthi movement. I think Nasir, he mentioned this attack on the United Arab Emirates. I think it was in January 2022. I did not consider the Houthi movement to be a terrorist actor in 2015, when the UAE and Saudi Arabia started their intervention into the civil war in Yemen. But I think it is beyond doubt that the organization has established itself as a major terrorist actor. At least, if you don't think about it in a political way, if you only think it from the point of view of a terrorism expert, of course they count. But that is something that will be quite a controversial thing in Europe. But that's my second point. We have to discuss these groups, and we have to take a closer look at them. There has been some movement in recent years. Germany, for example, has outlawed several organizations related to Hezbollah. Perhaps even more importantly, it has given out a license to prosecute Hezbollah members and supporters as terrorist supporters or members in Germany. I think it was 2 years ago. But that's definitely one of the most important points. And now my last point is, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's probably the most problematic topic in this regard between Germans and Emiratis. You have put them on a terrorism list. I do not consider the Muslim Brotherhood to be a terrorist organization, at least not its mainstream, because it simply does not perpetrate terrorist attacks. Hamas does, but it's a distinct organization. You might even consider to be Ahrar al-Sham in Syria, a partly Muslim Brotherhood-related organization, as a terrorist group. But then you will have to think about your relations to Turkey, but I know that's a different point. What I do agree with, however, is that the Muslim Brotherhood is, of course, an extremist organization, and in certain contexts, it can be quite dangerous to governments, to states, and to Muslim communities in Europe. And again, here, there is a major change, and I think it has got to do with the wave of terrorist attacks between 2014 and 2017. It has got to do with the influx of many Syrians and Iraqis from, let's say, problematic origins in the eastern parts of Syria or the northwestern parts of Iraq, who are prone to accept at least parts of these ideologies. And I think the major danger lies in the very fact that the Brotherhood has been so successful in influencing mainstream Muslim discourse. So that in many European migrant communities, people have the impression that that many things that would have been considered to be Islamist thinking and not Muslim thinking 20 years ago are purely mainstream Islam. And when I say that that this rather critical view of the Muslim Brotherhood has gained ground in Europe in recent years, I think it's only the beginning. We have seen the debate in France with the debate over what President Macron called separatism. Perhaps even more importantly, in a small country, you would say medium country, it's 10 million people. No, it's 9 million people, it's Austria. And I think it's one of the most interesting experiments with regard to our handling of the Brotherhood in Europe. Although Austria is not the most important country on the continent, although Austria is of course not a member of NATO, only of the European Union, Austria is practically, by going through the justice system, trying to establish that, first, the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization. And if that doesn't work, it is at least an extremist organization that poses a danger to the Austrian state, which would also be punishable by law. Right now, a big, major, pioneering trial is being prepared in Graz. That's the capital of Styria. I hope that's a known region. That's one of the states in Austria, which will have repercussions not only in Austria, but also in neighboring countries. And some of the most important representatives of the Brotherhood in Austria are on trial over there. First, because of membership in a terrorist organization. My personal view is that won't work, not even in the Austrian system, not even in a conservative state like Styria. But secondly, and that is extremely important, it might be that it will be considered by a major court to be an organization that is inimical to the Austrian state. And these are developments I think that will have repercussions. I think there are some developments that can be registered in Germany and other countries as well, where the trend has been to put a barrier before the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood. Perhaps some of the events that have been criticized this afternoon have been connected to that. Perhaps some demonstrations in Berlin because of the death of Shirin Abu Akleh have been organized by the wrong people, and that might be the reason why they have been outlawed. But in general, there is a growing trend not only among the smaller European states, but also among the bigger ones to stop the activities of the Brotherhood in a way below the level of labeling them as a terrorist organization, which, I repeat myself, I would consider to be a major mistake, because it would blur the lines between those organizations which are purely interested in attacking violently our societies, like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, like Hezbollah, and those which have chosen a much more sophisticated political, but possibly equally dangerous way. Thank you.
Thank you, Gideon. You raised many important issues, and some of them also controversial, and it depends, I said, where you stand. This is how you perceive the things. When there is a group destabilizing your security, for sure, you will consider it as a terrorist group. And there is, maybe you have to broaden your perspective and towards now what how do you label a terrorist group? Is it only by action? There are, and by ideology as well, and this is the Muslim Brotherhood, what they are doing. When they have this concept of Islamic Khilafah, which include the whole world, which it means also the Western world, and working on that. It looks charming like Maqsoud on the surface, but deeply, deeply they are really having those kind of ideology which encouraging the extremist action. They did not condemn ISIS. They have their financial networks, and I think Europe, if it didn't take maybe this kind, when we are talking about cooperation between you and us in terms of facing the extremism, this is something we have to reach a common ground. How we also, you don't see the Houthis are a terrorist group, not you, your country, because but when they have because I know when we talk to your counterparts, they're saying they are one of the Yemeni components. We agree, but is all Yemeni components have missiles, have drones, they have all these arms? They don't have. And they are using it against their people, against their neighbors. And here, of course, you don't, when you mentioned Shia's terrorist group, we have a very good publication. It's old, but still you can have it as a reference. And here we both analyze the Sunni group, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and others, and also the Shiite group, which Asa'ib al-Haq, Hezbollah, Houthis, and we name it in killing in the name of God, which shows that both of them, they have the same ideology, but the organization is different, but both of them, they have the same ideology. I do understand that I'm against any discrimination against the sectarian, but I do understand in the West that you see that you have not been attacked by a Shiite terrorist group. Always you have been attacked by a Sunni group. That's why when you looking to which is more dangerous, you see that only the Sunni group are more dangerous. I will not take, but I have also my question in terms how we can collaborate, UAE and Germany in this issue. This is my question. When we finish, please, if you can elaborate on that. Dr. August, please, floor is yours.
That our topic is strengthening religious and cultural diplomacy. Therefore, let me start with the soft issue. The soft issue is we have established...
I am the only hard issue here.
No, Mr. Steinberg has dealt all with the hard issues. But let me start with this soft issue. We have, in Germany, there are living nearly 6 million Muslims in Germany. We are a migration society. We have got a lot of migrants after the Second World War. In the 60s, we got a lot of migrants from Europe. And then we got a lot of migrants from the Islamic states, especially from Turkey and from North Africa. And then we have started the so-called Islam Conference. When I was Deputy Minister of the Interior, we had a discussion with my minister, and the proposal was we have to start a dialogue with the Muslim community in Germany. And we have started this, we call it in German Islam Conference. I think Hussam is very familiar with this project. And then we have learned, of course, a lot. We have learned that there is not, let me say, a well-orchestrated voice on the Muslim side. There is no Pope in Rome. There is authority in Cairo, I've learned. But there have been very different views. There is a very split community in Germany. And this makes things difficult, of course, for us, for the state. But we have learned a lot. And I think it was a very necessary exercise, because it is not easy to integrate the Muslim community too in Germany. We are historically, of course, a Christian state, and therefore we have to do our best to integrate the Muslim community. On the one side, of course, we are strictly dividing in Germany religion and the state, but of course, many behavior of the German state is related to the Christian religion. Therefore, it's very necessary to have this kind of dialogue. Again, I think that is the German attempt to deal with these problems. I think in the end of the day, yes, it is necessary. I hope it was successful. But on the other side, of course, we are facing problems in Germany on behalf of terrorism. You see, you have mentioned this, right-wing terrorism, we have left-wing terrorism, extremism. The biggest terrorist attack in Germany happened 30 years ago in the München Oktoberfest. We have suffered nearly 20 victims and more than 200 people have been injured. We have this RAF problem, the left-wing problem. And of course, we got the wake-up call in 9/11, and we saw that members of this group which carried out this attack lived in Hamburg, and some of them in your country. And therefore, that was a reason for me to go to your country as head of the intelligence at that time. And we have organized a very close cooperation. We have exchanged our views. And my impression is, and that was the question here today, I think we have really a very close cooperation in the field of intelligence. And we have initiated this at that time, after 9/11, and I think it's still very close. I think UAV is the closest partner in the region for the German foreign intelligence. I don't want to go into the details. In a lot of fields, very sensitive fields, and I think that is really a very successful exercise. Coming back to terrorism. I've already mentioned we are a migration society. When I was appointed as head of the BND, my staff told me, I was in Munich at that time, the center, there are a lot of Chinese agents in Munich. And my question was, what are they doing in Munich? Yes, that is the World Congress of the Uyghurs, you know. And therefore I've learned the problem in China, Uyghurs. And this shows that Germany, of course, is to a certain extent a victim of conflicts outside. We see this in Uyghurs, China. We see this towards Turkey with the PKK. We have always a problem. You see, on the one side, the PKK people are telling us we are freedom fighters, and the Turkish authorities are telling us all are terrorists, and we have to deal with these problems. There are other examples. We see this in Lebanon with Hezbollah, which Mr. Steinberg has already mentioned. We see this in other states of the world. How should we deal with these kind of problems? We always try to understand the roots of terrorism. We can't solve the problems. We have tried to do this in Afghanistan with a limited success. You can't solve these problems via intervention from outside. But nevertheless, it's very important to understand this phenomena, and therefore dialogue is very important. And we are enjoying this dialogue, especially with your side. You have a better insight in the Muslim world, and therefore this kind of dialogue is very valuable for us. Yes, looking into the future, I'm not very optimistic. We see the growing tensions in the region. We have mentioned the problems in Egypt. We see this in Turkey. But nevertheless, I think during the last years, I think we have been successful in Germany to prevent our society from further terrorist attacks. But it needs a lot of efforts. It needs a lot of, let me say, yes, cooperation. Cooperation not only in the field of intelligence, but on the field of the police. And therefore, I think, yes, the future of our cooperation between Germany and UAE, from my point of view, is very positive. And still, but nothing is so good that you couldn't improve this. And therefore, I'm very confident for the future for our very close cooperation in this field. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I would say UAE took really advanced steps in terms of how it's not only countering terrorism in terms of security action, to countering the ideology. One of those initiatives, Hidayah, which Maqsoud used to be there. We call it the Muslim Wise Council. We have also another council on Islam and non-Muslim societies. We create that, in fact, that Abraham Accord, it's part of that. The Abraham House, which we are hosting in Abu Dhabi. Many initiatives. So it's also countering the extremist ideology is very important in this regard. And I think also you need, because you open your land for everybody to come. I do understand your liberal system, but sometimes when you open the window, the air, the nice air comes. Also, all the insects are coming with that air. So you have to put screen, okay, to filter that air which is coming from outside. I will open the floor for discussion, and please, those whom they have still the energy to discuss. Yusuf.
Shukran.
Thank you very much. I'm not a naughty Dr. Ebtesam. I just want to share two remarks, and these two remarks are at the same time questions. The European vision about the Muslim Brotherhood, it is not new. The Western look and vision at the Muslim Brotherhood, and I'm not talking exclusively about France or Germany, they look at this Muslim Brotherhood in the same way before the terrorism and the countering of terrorism. During the first decade that was labeled the Arab Spring, in that decade, this political Islam party took power, and we call them Islamists, not Islamic people, because there are threats of the use and there are risks of using the word Islamic terrorism. We use Islamist because we do not want to link the religion with terrorism, because as there is Muslim terrorists, there are Christian terrorists, Buddhist terrorists, etc. It's why there are risks about this Islamophobia that spreads in Europe and in particular in Germany, because the hatred of Islam as a religion will affect the German citizens, the 8 million Germans, and some estimations say that there will be almost 20 million people in Germany who might be Muslims. It's why there are parties who are using wrongfully the paper of the religion of Islam in order to create more hatred and divide in the European country. It's why I would like to go back to the Muslim Brotherhood group. I would like to say that since the 40s of last century until now, all the terrorist groups were inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood, and I can tell you examples since the 40s of last century. The leaders of Al-Qaeda, the leaders of Nusra Front and ISIS and other terrorist groups. We do not say how some international entities we do not ignore how some international governments and foreign governments facilitated the work of the Muslim Brotherhood in Europe and in the West in general. There is one thing that is mainstream in Europe. They look at the extremist groups. There is a development and an evolution in looking at these groups, and this is important in order to keep the stability of the Western societies. But I would like to say also that through your association, you should diffuse these threats of the Islamist, this political Islam, because we are talking about a lot of categories, including the migrants and Muslims who are living in Germany. Of course, this will affect some interest. The last point I would like to share with you is that I have taken part in the Christian-Muslim dialogue since for decades. We have never used the religious diplomacy because this means politicizing religion. The foreign policy has nothing to do with the beliefs and faiths. It has nothing to do with that. If the objective is respecting diversity, we can say that, we can describe that by saying the cultural diplomacy and not the religious diplomacy. Otherwise, we will go back to Samuel Huntington and the clash of civilizations. So I do believe, as a researcher, that the religious diplomacy is ambiguous and has ambiguous objectives. And even the actions it talks about are ambiguous. And I will conclude by saying, as Dr. Ebtesam said, I'm not saying we discovered who are the Muslim Brotherhood, but I would like to say that this type of political Islam parties which use the religion they have been countered and exposed in the Arab world in general, in all the Arab countries. And I would like to add that when my dear colleague talked about the fact that terrorism starts with the talk, which means that the idea is the start of all forms of extremism. So this ideology evolves, develops, and if we delve deeply, we will find that there is always an ideology of this Muslim Brotherhood, especially in the Arabian Peninsula. And of course, this development of the way of thinking about what's happening in our societies is something encouraging. And I think that Germany, if it contributes in this direction, this will be useful in countering terrorism, extremism, all forms of extremism. Thank you very much, Nasser. Thank you, Dr. Ebtesam.
When I was a child, my nanny was a Shiite, up to 9 years old, and this is just to say, we don't have an issue with, with the sect, but the issue is, we're talking about terrorism here. There are two things that I did not hear from the speakers, and I would like, to hear about it from them. One of them is cyber terrorism. Cyber warfare is becoming an issue. Cyber terrorism is becoming an issue, and I'm sure that this is an area that will be very important to both Germany and the UAE. The other thing is it's becoming so easy to become a terrorist. It required some prerequisites in the past, training and so on. But all it takes today is a very simple drone that you can buy from Amazon, most probably. And, and so, becoming a terrorist is so easy. And we have a generation, post-Arab Spring, we have kids, whether Syrians and other from other countries in the region, who have, they have never been to schools, and they're living in refugee camps, and we never know what they are, what their value system is, okay? So this is, the last speaker, when you say you're not optimistic, I am always optimistic, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. What's coming our way?
Thank you, Nasser. Anybody else? Okay, I will return to our speaker, and I will start with Maqsoud.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Looking into the discussion that we've seen today, I also want to share a couple of thoughts that I felt were not mentioned, and in a way there was an oversimplification of the diagnosis, of the understanding of what is happening. You see, if I use this pen and I poke someone's eyes as an act of terrorism, should we ban all pens on the planet? The answer is no. Therefore, the evolution of the technology, the evolution of the platform is not the issue, because terrorist groups will continue to find ways to hurt. The real question is this: why some of us are drawn into becoming terrorists, and why some of us have the necessary immunity, they're resilient to becoming terrorists. In other words, instead of focusing on the policing, security, defense approaches to how to deal with terrorism, we need to dig deeper. We need to have some sort of societal autopsy. We need to deconstruct the concepts, the ideas, the ideologies, the thoughts behind these processes, because they feel they have a purpose. They have a meaning, they have a mission. There's a reason why they do what they do. It's not just they wake up one day and they decide to blow up themselves. And it's not because we put some money into their account so they're doing a job. It is much deeper than this, even if we want to deny. It's easy to close the borders, and now we have virtual terrorism, cyber terrorism, and we knew many years ago borders are not the issue. We can stop weapons. We can take chemicals out of pharmacies so they can't assemble things. We can make the knives on the airplane plastic. Yet, the purpose of hurting and being a perpetrator starts in the mind. It's that idea that triggers an emotional response that leads to a behavior that we call violence or terrorism. And I would argue this is where we are still collectively failing to address and unable to do. The second important point, and another thought I haven't heard, is the issue of prevention. We're being too tactical. It's all about the now and the here and what we need to do. Terrorism is part of an extension of extremism in the sense, what is the software that we're dealing with? And instead we're looking into the different applications. Can we target the main software? Can we go to the main programming? Why within, let's say, the context that we're talking about, we have all these manifestations of terrorism and extremism regardless of what we call it? Frankly, prevention is key. Community is a must, and we need to always look into this when it's totality. Just looking at the tactical component, while it's important, and I acknowledge why it's significant, but yet we are still missing the big elephant in the room. Why some of us feel they need to join these groups, although they come from wealthy background, they come from a good education. And if you look at the classical examples of Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden comes from a filthy rich background. Ayman al-Zawahiri is an MD who's supposed to be helping people. He's not doing that. And the list goes on. The question remains why they do that. I think more is needed to be done to understand and to be able to intervene. As long as we are unable to provide an alternative to our youth, they will continue to resort when they have their frustrations, when they don't know how to resolve their issues, their grievances, on whatever existential dilemmas they go through. I think a bit of sophistication and depth is required. Thank you.
Thank you, Maqsoud. Excellent. Guido.
First, about the religiosity of the terrorists. I don't think that Osama bin Laden is instrumentalizing religion, or was. Luckily, he was. I believe he's a true believer. He thought of himself as a true Muslim. Whether he's good or not, you decide. But he was a believer. He believed in what he said, and that's why he was ready to die for it. And that, I think, holds true for most people who join these organizations. So this talk about, well, this is, how do you say that, Tasis ad-Din, politicizing religion, I don't think it's true. I think many of these people, especially the leaders, and especially many of the religious thinkers, the religious or the ideological leaders, they believe in the religious foundations. Now, you might say this is not the true religion or so, but I simply don't buy this stuff that they are instrumentalizing the religion. That might hurt a believer, but I think that's an important point. And I do believe in the importance of ideology. And this trend to think of terrorism as something pathological that you can treat by going to the patient and applying your prevention programs, you might do that. That might be successful in an individual case. But it's an ideology that draws its strength from deep religious foundations. That is why it is so attractive to so many people. And you can't fight an ideology. It's a phenomenon that we simply have to live with. So many people have been attracted by the war in Syria due to certain ideological and religious convictions. And you can't do anything about it by building prevention programs. You could perhaps do that in a country like Germany. We have between 1,000 and 2,000 jihadists in the country. But is it really worth it? I would always argue, well, bring these people to jail. 1,000 or 2,000 in a country of 83 million is nothing. I simply do not believe in a pathology, first in denying the religious dimension of the problem, And secondly, I do not believe in a pathology of terrorism. It's the ideology. And if you want to have evidence, just take a look at where these people come from. They do not come from, I don't know, from certain quarters. There is no profile. There is no profile to the jihadist terrorist in Saudi Arabia. There is none in Germany, and so on. The only thing that they have in common is they share a common ideology, and they usually draw it from the teachings of certain ideologues, from certain preachers, in certain mosques and at certain universities. And ISIS ideology does have an address. Just take a look at where all the young preachers want to study in order to get the foundations. It's the Islamic University in Medina. Because the basis, and that's my second criticism with regard to what you said, it's not the Muslim Brotherhood anymore. It was for a long time, but actual current terrorism, ISIS terrorism, is hardly influenced by Muslim Brotherhood thinking. It's Wahhabi thinking. They don't read Sayyid Qutb anymore. They read Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, Hamad bin Atiq, Abdullah Ababtain, and all these guys. They don't, and they are not influenced by Sayyid and Muhammad Qutb anymore. And Saiba, I'll leave that to you, I think. And perhaps a last point, because I said so many negative things. It's not so easy to become it's easy to become a terrorist, but it's very hard to become a successful terrorist. Yeah? It was easy in 2001 because everybody slept. The Saudis did, the Germans did, if I may say so.
Always.
The Germans did, the Americans did. But ever since, it's not anymore. It was easy for a time to become a terrorist because it was so easy to travel to Syria. Again, that has something to do with Turkey. We leave that topic aside. But even after 2 years, it wasn't easy anymore. And that is why so many of these young people started trying to perpetrate attacks on their own. But who did manage to perpetrate a successful terrorist attack in recent years without the help of a major terrorist organization? I challenge you. Give me a case. Who perpetrated a really successful terrorist attack without the help of an organization? The German Nazis, they can. That's bad. But the Islamists among them always had the support of organizations like ISIS, who coached them virtually and simply presented them the idea to use a trailer truck. But these were directed attacks. All those who acted on their own didn't perpetrate successful attacks. And I think that's positive. And it has got to do with the things that we have been doing. Your government has been doing, the Saudi government, the American government, and so on. And I think two things are essential. First, you have to keep big organizations from emerging. You won't keep single personalities or small groups from joining terrorist organizations, but you can keep them from developing major power bases, like what happened in Afghanistan before 2001, what happened in Syria and Iraq after 2014. If these organizations don't have these power bases, they are not successful. And the second thing you can do, you can't fight the ideology, but you can fight the ideologists. And I have mentioned this strange city in Styria, in Austria. The Austrians, for all that is wrong about this country, and for all that doesn't work, I hope there is no Austrian here.
German arrogance. Okay.
For all that is wrong, the Austrians did something very clever. They had a major ideologue, Al-Qaeda ideologue in the country. He was a Serbian citizen, Abu Taima. He was arrested early on. Recruitment for the jihad in Syria stopped. The Germans were a year later when they arrested the main ISIS recruiter in the country. He was a major preacher in one of the German cities, Abu Wala al-Iraqi. And the German numbers were a lot higher. So arrest the ideologues, close the mosques, and you might realize that's one of my major points. Keep your young people from going to universities in the Arab world where they might be confronted with the wrong version of religious ideology, not religion. Among them, possibly the Islamic University in Medina.
Well, Guido, I might not agree with you for the last statement, and also it's not only the organization, there is those states whom they are also, okay, promoting these kind of terrorist groups like Asab al-Haq, like Hezbollah, like Al-Houthi also. It's not only another ideologue, okay, but promoted by state, not by organization. Please, Mr. Augustine.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, a small remark on behalf of successful terrorism. I think successful terrorism needs safe harbors and needs states which are sponsoring this kind of terrorism. I think that's a very important point. And this Al-Qaeda attack 9/11 could only happen while Afghanistan was at that time a safe harbor for Al-Qaeda. And we see that Qatar in the past was a safe harbor. We see in the case of the Houthi rebels that Iran is sponsoring a safe harbor. I think that's a very important issue, and that is, of course, point of cooperation between us to exchange our information in this field, because again, terrorist groups which have this backing of safe harbors and states are the most dangerous ones. And we have seen this in ISIS in Syria, and we are blaming always the Russians for intervention in Syria. But in fact, ISIS was under pressure from the Assad regime with the backing of Russia, and afterwards no more terrorist attacks in Europe have happened. Before we had these attacks in Paris and Brussels, and there have been other attacks in preparation, we knew and we know, and therefore, again, you have to attack these terrorist groups in their safe harbors. On the other side, we see these problems mentioned from that we see all these camps there in Syria, we see all these homeless people there, and that is feeding terrorism on the other side. Therefore, I'm less optimistic, I have to confess. To your remark, Islamophobia in Germany, I don't think that there is really Islamophobia in Germany. You see, we have more than 3,000 mosques in Germany without any problems. We have sometimes problems with extremist prayers, imams, and I remember I could tell it, we are in a secret environment. The head of the Moroccan intelligence, and I had a discussion with him about Islamism and so on, and he told me, oh, do you control these imams? I said, no, it's not possible. We are in a liberal state in Germany. In Morocco, it's not possible. We are always looking what they are telling in the mosque. You have to do the same. You have to do the same to control the prayers and the speeches of the imam. We are not doing this, but of course, we have sometimes some problems with special mosques. We try to deal with them, and you have mentioned the question of prevention. I think the intelligence services, they are, of course, preventing it. We are looking, the intelligence services, they try to look into the organizations, they try to gain sources, they have the signal intelligence effort and so on. I think that is one, to a certain extent, a prevention. On the other side, we have a lot of studies, for example, in Germany and in the Western world, that jails are one of the main sources of terrorists, for example. We have a lot of programs to prevent young people from being terrorists and so on. I think there are a lot of efforts. And as I've already mentioned, I think one source is, of course, yes, there are these ethnic and religious clashes in the society. And therefore, I've mentioned this Islam conference as a very important point for prevention. Coming back to cyber terrorism, yes, cyber terrorism is a very important issue. The main sources of this terrorism are, unfortunately, Russia, Ukraine, North Korea. We knew this very well. And there is, of course, international cooperation bitterly needed. And I think it takes place with the United States, with you. I think that is one of the main tasks of the intelligence organizations, to prevent our societies for this kind of cyber attacks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all our speakers for this fruitful discussion. And I know you are tired.